In a world where war seems endless and weapons define power, what would you think of a leader who orders his soldiers to lower their rifles and step into the fields? Instead, would you call it weakness, or would you pause just for a moment and ask yourself what kind of war truly matters most to a starving nation? This is not a distant theory. This is Burkina Faso, where in July 2025, a decision shattered old expectations. 8,000 young fighters, once the defenders of their people against insurgents and armed groups, were sent not to the front lines but to the farmlands. No flags of conquest, no parades of victory, just the quiet planting of seeds in a land that has tasted too much blood and too little bread. So the question remains, what is the real strength of a nation? Is it the number of guns it holds or the number of lives it feeds? And if you believe the answer lies not in bullets, but in bread, not in battles, but in harvests, tell me, what would you call this kind of courage? Hope or something greater? If you understand this struggle, leave one word below. Hope, still standing. Amen. On a quiet morning in July 2025, Burkina Faso stunned the world with a single broadcast. The government officially announced the redeployment of 8,000 volunteer fighters, not to a war zone, but to the farmlands. This was no ceasefire, no peace treaty, and no political reshuffle. It was a radical shift in national strategy. The statement was clear. The battlefield is now the soil. The enemy is hunger. And the images that followed left no room for doubt. Thousands of young men and women still wearing military trousers, carrying farming tools beneath the national flag. No guns, no war cries, just fields of maize, cassava, and rice. Later, another revelation surfaced. 2,000 fighters had already undergone secret agricultural training, learning not only how to grow food but how to rebuild lands left abandoned by both war and aid. It was not the end of defense. It was the beginning of a different war. But how did Traore reach this decision, and who were these young fighters entrusted with planting the nation's future? But who were these young fighters that President Traore chose to trust with the future of his nation? Were they elite soldiers with international training? Were they career officers schooled in military academies? No. They were something far more ordinary and far more extraordinary. They were the volunteers for the defense of the homeland, the VDPs, a force born not out of state power, but out of desperation. Formed in 2020, when Burkina Faso was buckling under the weight of insurgent groups, foreign militias, and internal collapse. In villages without police, without food banks, without hope for tomorrow, it was young men and women who stood up and said, if no one will protect us, we will protect ourselves. And what do you call a force like that? Mercenaries, militias, heroes, or something else entirely? A raw, unpolished heartbeat of a nation in distress. These were farmers' sons, traders' daughters, shepherds, school dropouts, street vendors, ex-child laborers. Many had never left their provinces before they were handed a weapon and a uniform. What united them wasn't military strategy, it wasn't ideology, it was survival and duty. For years they held the fragile front lines where the state could not reach. In the forests, in the deserts, in the remote northern provinces where maps faded into rumor. And they paid the price. Thousands of VDPs died in ambushes and skirmishes. Others returned home wounded, carrying scars both seen and unseen. And still many were dismissed by the media and foreign observers as untrained, chaotic militias. To some, they were symbols of a nation's last resort. To others, they were its shame. But to Ibrahim Traoré, they were something else entirely. He saw them not as expendable tools of wartime necessity, but as the nucleus of something larger, a new kind of national philosophy. Young, loyal, rooted in their communities and accustomed to sacrifice. They weren't a stopgap, they were the beginning. So when famine and food insecurity began to rival bullets as the nation's deadliest threats, Traoré didn't look to foreign NGOs, expensive consultants, or technocrats flown in from Geneva or Paris. He looked at the VDPs. Because they already knew discipline, they already knew chain of command, they already knew what it meant to fight for land. And then came the boldest decision of all. He ordered that these volunteers be retrained not as soldiers, but as agricultural commandos. In secluded training camps, they were stripped of their wartime reflexes and slowly introduced to something far more difficult: patience. Because farming, unlike war, does not reward speed. It does not give you victory overnight. It demands care, seasons of waiting, and faith in something invisible beneath the soil. And for young men and women who had learned to survive minute by minute, that transformation was no small feat. But they learned faster than anyone expected. Because beneath the exhaustion and trauma, something deeper remained alive: the instinct to protect life, not just defend it. And their communities noticed. Villagers who once fled at the sound of boots now gathered to help plant trees. Children who had been taught to hide when the VDPs passed through their streets now followed them to irrigation sites carrying buckets and seedlings. These soldiers were no longer guardians of death. They were guardians of harvest. But Traore's vision didn't stop there. Military trucks once painted in camouflage were repainted for seed transport and irrigation projects. Old deployment maps once used to track insurgent movements were redrawn as agricultural zones marked not with targets but with crops. Maize here, cassava there, rice paddies along the floodplains, reforestation efforts in degraded belts, battlefields repurposed as green corridors. And this wasn't symbolic, it was structural. Where aid organizations and private investors had long abandoned rural provinces, the VDPs now moved in with shovels, water pumps, and a blueprint for self-reliance. It wasn't charity, it was national defense reimagined. But ask yourself this: why take such a risk? Why trust the future of your food supply to young people who had spent their lives fighting, not farming? Was it desperation, or was it something more deliberate? Perhaps Traore understood a deeper truth: that those who have defended a land in blood are the ones most willing to cultivate it with care. That those who have buried their friends in its soil may be the ones who plant the seeds for something better. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was not simply a food security strategy. It was a healing act. Because what is the legacy of a nation that has only known war? What is the future of a people whose hands have only held weapons? If a nation's youth are taught only to destroy, what will they build when the war ends? Traore refused to wait for peace talks or ceasefires. He chose to build peace from the ground up, quite literally. And in doing so, he asked his country a radical question: what if we stopped defending our nation from fear and started defending it from hunger? What if the front line was not where we kill, but where we grow? This was no longer just a change in tactics, it was a change in meaning. Defense was no longer about the absence of enemies, it was about the presence of abundance. And so across Burkina Faso, a quiet transformation began. No grand parades, no speeches to the United Nations. Just young men and women once feared as fighters, now trusted as farmers, walking into villages with open hands and a silent promise: this land will feed us, and no one will take that away again. But what war was Traore truly fighting? Was it only against insurgents lurking in the forests, or was it something deeper, older, and far more invisible, a war against the memory of waiting? For decades, Burkina Faso had lived in cycles of drought and desperation. Each failed harvest was met not with solutions, but with donations. And each donation came not as a gift, but as a reminder: you cannot survive without help. Trucks bearing foreign logos rolled into starving villages, dropping sacks of rice onto dusty tarps. And every grain, every meal, though it kept people alive, also whispered the same message: you cannot feed yourselves. And what happens to a nation that hears those words again and again, year after year, generation after generation? It begins to believe them. It begins to internalize helplessness as destiny, to normalize dependency as identity. But Ibrahim Traoré saw this for what it was: not charity, but control. Because aid, in his view, was never neutral. It came with logos and slogans, yes, but it also came with conditions subtle and soft, but binding nonetheless: political alignment, security cooperation, silence when injustice arrived wearing a Western flag. So when famine loomed once more and hunger rose not as a temporary crisis, but as a systemic threat, Traoré made his most defiant choice yet. He cut the rope, he refused to beg. and in doing so he turned agriculture into an act of resistance. Every seed planted by a former fighter was a rejection of the narrative that Burkina Faso must wait for rescue. Every harvested field was a refusal to kneel before donor conferences thousands of miles away. Every irrigation project led by the VDPs was a quiet declaration that sovereignty does not come wrapped in plastic food aid, but in the ability to feed your people without permission. And the results began to speak louder than any speech could. In pilot zones where these agricultural brigades were first deployed, food production didn't just increase, it transformed local economies. Villages once dependent on the World Food Program began supplying surplus grain to neighboring communities. Regions where aid trucks were the only lifeline now saw markets reopen with produce flowing from fields tended not by foreign experts but by local hands. Irrigation projects designed and built by the VDPs themselves doubled the planting seasons in drought-prone areas. State-run seed banks, once filled with imported stocks, were now replenished by domestic overproduction. And in the marketplaces, a new energy stirred, one born not of scarcity management, but of abundance creation. But this wasn't just about food, it was about psychology. Because what happens to a people who for the first time in their lives witness their own communities solve their own crises, the fear shifts, the story changes. No longer is the central question, who will save us? Instead, it becomes, what can we grow for ourselves? And that shift from waiting to working, from begging to building, is perhaps the most profound defense strategy Traore ever conceived. Still, critics remained. International observers cautioned that rejecting aid could create dangerous humanitarian gaps. Economists warned of supply chain disruptions. Diplomats whispered of political isolation. But Traore remained unmoved because he wasn't betting on a utopia. He was engineering a systemic shift, one that reprogrammed the national survival instinct from dependency to self-reliance. And here is where the battle truly turned. Foreign aid, for all its good intentions, operates on a crisis response model. A bad harvest triggers a new request. A new request sparks donor negotiations. A temporary solution buys time until the next drought. But Traore was building something else entirely, a circular regenerative economy rooted in the land itself. One good harvest didn't just feed families for a season, it generated seed stock for the next. It built trust in local systems. It restored dignity, and dignity, unlike charity, does not expire when the funding cycle ends. So he went further. In major cities, billboards rose showing former fighters in the fields, their hands holding seedlings instead of rifles beneath the words, "Our food, our freedom." School textbooks were rewritten to include chapters on food sovereignty, teaching children that agriculture was not just a livelihood, but a patriotic duty. National television during primetime slots, once reserved for political debate or foreign films, now broadcast tutorials on composting, crop rotation, and irrigation techniques. This wasn't propaganda, it was re-education. A nation learning to see itself not as a perpetual victim of geography, but as a steward of its own land. But ask yourself, why was this necessary? Because Traore knew that the first things colonial powers targeted were not just gold or cotton, but land and labor. And for decades after independence, Africa's leaders had allowed those two forces, land and labor, to be controlled, not by their own people, but by foreign hands, through trade deals, development loans, and food aid packages. By turning soldiers into farmers and fallow fields into breadbaskets, Traore was reclaiming both. And this is why when Burkina Faso began refusing rice shipments or declining international food grants, it wasn't seen as negligence. It was understood, at least by those paying attention, as a message that said, we remember what it felt like to wait for help that came too late, and we are done waiting. But still, the deeper question lingers. Is this model sustainable? Can a nation so long shaped by scarcity truly break free from it? Or will the old ghosts return with the next drought, the next economic crisis, the next wave of conflict? Traore does not claim to have all the answers. But in every field, newly planted by former fighters, in every village that no longer waits for outside aid, one answer becomes undeniable. Sovereignty begins when dependency ends. And sometimes the most radical revolution doesn't march in parades or shout in summits. It simply plants a seed and waits. But what happens when soldiers once trained to destroy begin to rebuild? What happens when hands that once pulled triggers now lift beams, lay bricks, and clear irrigation canals? In the remote village of Dugu, where the roads had long been forgotten and the rivers ran dry, they called them something new, the Green Brigade. Not because they wore green uniforms, though they did, but because they brought life where before there was only dust. These were the retrained VDPs, the young men who had once patrolled with rifles slung across their backs, now carrying sacks of fertilizer and solar-powered water pumps. And they did not stop at farming, because when they arrived in villages like Dugu, they found a land broken in more ways than hunger alone. The roads were crumbling. The bridges had collapsed. The canals that once carried water to the fields were clogged with debris and time. And so they asked themselves, not in waiting for a ministerial decree, not in anticipation of foreign engineers, what would happen if we fixed this ourselves? And they did. 2 bridges once fallen and forgotten were rebuilt with nothing but local stone wood and the determination of men who had learned to survive with far less. They reopened abandoned irrigation canals, clearing out years of sediment and weeds until the water flowed once more. They constructed solar-powered pumps to draw water for fields that had lain fallow for seasons too long. No international press release announced this work. No NGO logos adorned their tools. It was quiet, purposeful, relentless, and as word spread, other villages called for them. In the eastern provinces, fighters deployed to cultivate rice fields discovered that the only road linking their fields to the nearest markets had become impassable, a scar of erosion and neglect. There were no state engineers nearby, no road crews, no budget allocations. So they found construction manuals, gathered local laborers, and rebuilt the road themselves using laterite gravel and muscle. Within 3 weeks, produce from their fields began flowing into markets that hadn't seen fresh vegetables in months. And elsewhere in the far north, where insecurity had forced schools to close and classrooms to rot, the VDPs looked beyond the fields. After restoring the surrounding farmland, they turned their tools toward the abandoned schoolhouse. They re-roofed the leaking classrooms. They repainted walls that had long faded into obscurity. They repaired desks, cleaned courtyards, and perhaps most profoundly helped recruit volunteer teachers from within their own ranks. And this is where the transformation deepened, because what began as farming became something more profound, a rural reconstruction movement. Not commanded from above, not mandated by policy, but born from initiative, the simple radical idea that the same discipline that held a battle line could build a future. Ask yourself, how often have we been told that rebuilding a broken country requires foreign architects, distant investments, or massive development loans? But what if it only required the will of those who knew that land best? And the impact was not only physical. In regions traumatized by years of conflict where ethnic divisions and political suspicion had hardened hearts, the arrival of these former fighters, now unarmed, now rebuilding, was disorienting. At first, villagers watched from a distance, skeptical, cautious. Could men who once carried fear on their backs now carry water and seeds instead? But as the wells were dug, as the trees were planted, as the roads reopened, and the schools welcomed children once more, something even rarer than infrastructure began to grow: trust. Village elders, who had once fled at the sound of boots, now welcomed the Green Brigade with food and thanks. Children who had once been taught to hide when fighters approached now ran to them eager to help plant a tree or carry a beam. Dialogue reopened between communities divided not only by conflict but by years of silence. And yet the change did not flow in one direction. These VDPs, many of whom had never been praised outside of their military duties, began to rediscover a sense of dignity they had never known. They were not merely alive. They were useful, needed, respected. One former fighter who led the bridge reconstruction in Dugu said to a local radio station, "When I was armed, people feared me. Now they call me when a bridge collapses or when their children are sick. It feels better this way." And perhaps that simple truth, it feels better this way, is the most powerful shift of all. Because rebuilding a nation is not only about roads, wells, and crops. It is about healing the fracture between a people and their idea of government, and nothing heals faster than a uniform that builds instead of breaks. This was the unspoken genius of Traoré's experiment. He had not only redefined defense, he had redefined service. The VDPs were no longer temporary shields against chaos. They were architects of a new normal, a normal where a uniform did not represent fear but hope, where discipline did not guard borders but planted futures. And in every village, in every field, in every rebuilt school, they carried something far more powerful than any weapon. Proof. Proof that a nation could rebuild itself without waiting for permission. Proof that youth long dismissed as victims or threats could be leaders of restoration. Proof that perhaps the most dangerous idea in a post-colonial Africa is not rebellion but self-reliance. And so they moved from region to region, field to field, village to village, not as warriors, not as saviors, but as a new kind of army, an army whose only conquest was the healing of their own homeland. But revolutions, even the quietest ones, do not remain unnoticed, especially not in a continent where hope travels faster than news and where desperation listens more closely than power ever will. In the weeks following Traoré's redeployment of soldiers to the soil, whispers began to spread across Africa's dusty border towns and crowded capital streets, not from official press conferences or diplomatic briefings, but from farmers sharing stories at the market, from teachers retelling what they heard on shortwave radios, from young people scrolling late at night on their phones, searching for something that finally made sense. And the whispers turned into questions. What if we tried the same? What if Niger's idle security forces could become dry season farmers instead of border guards? What if Guinea's retired logistics units managed food storage, not military stockpiles? What if Senegal, long entangled in Western aid networks, could redirect part of its defense budget toward national food sovereignty? In Niger, a youth leader tweeted with cautious admiration, "If Traoré's farmers end hunger, it won't be a policy, it will be prophecy." And across Bamako, Conakry, and Dakar, these conversations crept into university debates, quiet ministry meetings, and youth forums, where for too long the only options presented to young Africans were exile or obedience. Because in Traoré's model, they saw something dangerous but also liberating. It wasn't a call for rebellion. It wasn't an anti-Western manifesto. It was simply an African solution to an African problem built with African hands, without waiting for international permission. No grand speech was made at the African Union. No summit was convened to declare this a new continental doctrine. And perhaps that is exactly why it resonated. While politicians argued over frameworks and trade blocs, Burkina Faso was quietly planting seeds in trenches where blood had once soaked the soil. While donor nations delayed the next relief package, Burkinabe farmers were already harvesting their first independent crop. And for the first time in a long time, young Africans were not looking to Europe, the UN, or China for models of progress. They were looking at each other. Because when a small landlocked country with no major exports and no global alliances begins to feed itself without apology, what excuse remains for the rest of us? And so we return to the question that refuses to fade. If a country like Burkina Faso, facing hunger, war, and isolation, could transform its reality with nothing but its own people and its own soil, then what stops the rest of us? This is not just a story of agriculture, it is a story of mindset, because the real famine in Africa today is not only food, it is belief. Belief that we are capable, belief that we are enough, belief that we can lead our own stories without waiting for outside rescue. Across the continent today, food insecurity is rising, droughts are worsening, aid dependency is deepening, and yet the youth millions strong are left asking, will we always be the generation that waits, or can we be the generation that builds? Traoré's Burkina Faso doesn't have all the answers. They still face countless challenges. The threat of insurgency remains. The economy is fragile. Infrastructure gaps are vast. But they stopped waiting. They planted the first seed. And sometimes that is where every revolution begins. So what's the lesson here? That real change rarely comes from the halls of power. It comes from the fields, the villages, the ordinary hands of people who refuse to give up. It comes when we redefine leadership, not as who speaks the loudest, but who feeds the most mouths, who restores the most lives, who builds what others said was impossible. And you watching this, whether from Africa or beyond, what story will your generation write? Will you repeat the cycles of dependence, or will you break them? Tell us in the comments, what would your nation's first step be if it stopped waiting and started building? Comment your country's name and the word that should define its next chapter. Courage, sovereignty, peace, harvest. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of Africans leading Africans, of solutions rising from within, not without, then join us at Spirit of Africa. This is more than a YouTube channel. It is a movement to reclaim our history, retell our present, and reimagine our future. One story, one leader, one community at a time. Because Africa's story does not end in struggle, it begins in sovereignty.